There's a quiet kind of suffering that hides behind usefulness. You see it in the person who never says no, who always finds a way to help, who measures their worth by how much they can give. They're the ones who hold everything together, but who often fall apart when no one is watching. To be useful, it sounds noble. It sounds good, even necessary. But when usefulness becomes identity, something fragile begins to break. You stop resting. You stop asking. You stop existing for yourself. And slowly, your kindness turns into exhaustion, your giving into self-erasure. This is not a story about laziness or selflessness. It's a story about the invisible tragedy that unfolds when a person forgets that they were worthy long before they were needed. You can replace this text with any text you wish. You can either write in this text box or paste your own text here. Try different languages and voices. Change the speed and the pitch of the voice. You can even tweak the SSML, speech synthesis markup language, to control how the different sections of the text sound. Click on SSML above to give it a try. Enjoy using text-to-speech. There's a certain type of person who can't sit still when someone else is struggling. They move toward pain instinctively, like gravity or habit. They're the first to volunteer, the one who stays late, the one who says, "It's okay, I'll handle it." To everyone around them, they are pillars. Reliable. Strong, they know what to do. They make things easier. And yet, beneath the calm, there's a quiet panic, a fear that if they ever stop being useful, they'll simply disappear. This fear doesn't scream. It hums softly, beneath the rhythm of everyday life. You can hear it in the way they apologize for resting, or in the silence that fills them when no one needs their help. They don't know who they are when they're not fixing, giving, doing. Their worth has been tied, for so long, to being needed that the thought of being unnecessary feels unbearable. They carry their usefulness like armor, heavy, polished, admired, but inside, it's suffocating. Because usefulness is conditional. It's a fragile kind of love that depends on staying productive, on being available, on constantly proving one's value. There are moments when they dream of slowing down, of saying no, of letting someone else take over. But the guilt arrives before the rest can begin. Their mind whispers, "If you stop helping, who will you be?" And so they return to motion, not because they want to, but because stopping feels like vanishing. In the world's eyes, they're selfless. In their own, they're afraid. Afraid that if they rest, they'll be forgotten. Afraid that if they speak of their exhaustion, they'll sound ungrateful. So they carry on, quietly. Their bodies keep score, shoulders tightening under invisible expectations. Hearts racing from the pressure to hold everything together. They smile as they listen, comfort as they crumble. They call it love. But sometimes, it's more like penance. There's a strange irony in being the one everyone relies on. The more dependable you are, the less people see your need for rest. The more you give, the more the world assumes you can. And so the cycle deepens, admiration on the outside, emptiness within. But this chapter, this recognition, is where awareness begins. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The fatigue, the resentment that feels like betrayal, the sadness that comes from being valued for what you do, not for who you are. This isn't a flaw in character. It's a quiet misunderstanding, one that began long before adulthood. A belief that love is something earned, that care must be justified, that usefulness is the only safe way to exist. And so, before healing can begin, there must be recognition. A moment of stillness where the helper realizes, I have spent so long being what others needed, that I no longer remember what I need. That realization, though painful, is the first form of freedom. No one is born believing they must earn their place in the world. That belief is learned, quietly, gradually, through the delicate exchanges of childhood. Somewhere in the early years, a child begins to notice a pattern. Love seems to arrive when they behave, when they help, when they please. Warmth follows achievement. Affection follows usefulness. And slowly, a seed is planted. The idea that being needed is safer than simply being. Perhaps it began in a home where chaos ruled, where parents were overwhelmed, and the child learned to become the calm in the storm. They discovered that when they cleaned up, stayed quiet, or smiled through discomfort, the tension eased. The adults praised them, called them mature, responsible, good. And though they were still small, a part of them felt powerful, as if their usefulness could hold the family together. Or maybe it began differently, in subtle emotional neglect. Not cruelty, but distance. A child reaching for connection, finding it only when they excelled. When they achieved, helped, or soothed, attention returned. And so, the child learned to trade authenticity for approval. Each small act of usefulness became a bridge to safety. Each moment of helping became proof of worth. By adolescence, the habit had become identity. The helper, the listener, the one who's always there. They didn't just play a role, they became it. Psychologists call this conditional self-worth, a pattern where self-esteem depends on meeting external standards. It's the emotional inheritance of a child who learned that love is transactional. And though this belief begins as survival, it later becomes a quiet prison, because the nervous system remembers. It remembers that stillness once meant disconnection. It remembers that saying no risked losing affection. So even in adulthood, when the danger is gone, the body still reacts, heart quickening at the thought of disappointing someone, guilt flooding in at the idea of rest. They keep performing the same ritual of usefulness, hoping that this time, it will finally bring peace. But peace never comes from performance. It comes from being seen, and that being seen is what these early experiences often denied. The child was valued for their behavior, not their being. For what they could offer, not for who they were. And so they grew up wearing a mask of competence, helping, fixing, giving, while quietly wondering if anyone would love them if they stopped. Behind their giving lies grief, the grief of never having been allowed to be simply human. Not useful. Not impressive. Just present. To understand this need is not to judge it, but to see the tenderness beneath it. The small, hopeful child still living inside the adult, still believing that if they stay useful enough, they'll finally feel safe, finally feel chosen. But love built on utility always trembles. Because deep down, they know, if usefulness can earn love, uselessness can lose it, and that fear is what keeps the pattern alive. There is a strange quietness in the mind of someone who has been useful for too long. They move through life in constant motion, yet feel oddly absent inside it, like a shadow following its own outline. Psychologists describe this as self-erasure, the gradual fading of one's inner voice beneath the noise of others' needs. It doesn't happen suddenly. It begins in subtle ways. You silence your opinion to keep the peace, you downplay your fatigue to appear reliable, you dismiss your desires because they seem inconvenient. At first, it feels noble, selfless, even. But over time, the habit becomes reflex, and the person forgets what their own preferences even are. From a neurological lens, this pattern has roots in survival. When the brain learns that safety depends on approval, it begins to associate usefulness with belonging. Each time the person helps and is praised, the dopamine reward system lights up, a small hit of chemical reassurance. You're safe. You matter. But the brain also learns fear. When help is not appreciated, or when the person says no, the body releases cortisol, triggering the same stress response as physical danger. Their nervous system can't tell the difference between rejection and threat. And so, they keep overfunctioning, helping, giving, fixing, not out of joy, but out of a biological need to feel secure. This is why simply telling someone to set boundaries doesn't work. Their usefulness isn't a choice, it's an instinct. Their mind has mistaken self-sacrifice for safety. There's another layer, the social one. We live in a world that rewards productivity more than presence. To rest is often seen as laziness, to prioritize oneself as selfishness. In workplaces, in families, even in friendships, useful people are celebrated until they collapse. The culture of constant contribution turns human worth into currency. And for those who grew up believing love must be earned, this culture feels painfully familiar. It reinforces their oldest wound, that value is something you must prove. The result is emotional exhaustion, what psychologists call empathy fatigue. It's not that they stop caring, it's that their capacity to feel becomes dulled by overuse. They start to live on autopilot, their gestures of kindness mechanical, their laughter slightly hollow. They're still giving, but the giving no longer connects to joy. Inside, there's often a quiet sadness, a longing to be cared for, just once, without having to earn it. But the fear of burdening others keeps that longing hidden. So they continue to disappear behind their usefulness, hoping someone will notice the person beneath the role. To be useful is beautiful. But when usefulness becomes identity, the self begins to fade, not in a dramatic way, but like a photo left too long in sunlight. And yet, somewhere beneath the fading, the self still waits, softly calling for recognition. There comes a moment when the endless giving begins to fracture. Not because the person stops caring, but because they finally start to break. It often happens quietly. One morning, they wake and realize their body feels heavy in ways it didn't before. The thought of showing up, of helping again, feels like dragging a weight through water. They look in the mirror and see the fatigue etched into their face, but they still whisper, "I can't stop now. They need me." And so they keep going, until something inside them begins to go numb. This is the paradox of constant giving. What once made them feel alive now drains the very life from them. Their empathy, once their greatest strength, becomes their weakness. Their boundaries dissolve until they're left with only the expectations of others. They start to notice a quiet resentment growing, an unfamiliar bitterness that feels wrong to feel. Because resentment doesn't fit their self-image. They're supposed to be kind, patient, reliable. But even kindness, when stretched too thin, begins to tear. They may start to withdraw, silently. Avoid calls, ignore messages, make excuses. Not because they've stopped loving, but because they're running out of pieces to give away. And when they finally try to rest, truly rest, guilt arrives like an uninvited guest. It whispers, "You're being selfish." It reminds them of all the people they could be helping, of all the ways they're falling short. That's when giving becomes a prison. Not one built by others, but by their own belief that love must always cost them something. Psychologists describe this as the guilt of self-preservation, a phenomenon where rest feels morally wrong, because the nervous system has confused depletion with virtue. It's the body's way of saying, "You've lived too long for others." The tragedy is that by trying to be everything for everyone, they end up feeling invisible. Their relationships become one-sided, their presence taken for granted. And when they finally break, no one understands why. Because they'd hidden their exhaustion so well. Some reach this point in burnout, others reach it in silence, through emotional detachment, quiet tears, or a deep sense of meaninglessness. It's not that they've stopped loving others. It's that they've forgotten how to love themselves. But there is something quietly transformative about this collapse. When the body and mind can no longer maintain the performance, a deeper truth begins to surface, that the need to be useful was never about generosity. It was about fear of being unwanted, unseen, replaceable. And when that truth is finally faced, something begins to shift. The person starts to ask different questions, not, "How can I help?" but, "What would happen if I stopped?" It is a terrifying question, but also a sacred one. Because only by facing the fear of being unnecessary can they begin to remember what it feels like to simply exist, and still be enough. There's a strange kind of silence that follows collapse. At first, it feels unbearable. The absence of noise, of purpose, of movement. For someone who has lived through usefulness, stillness feels like failure. But if they stay in that silence long enough, something softer begins to appear beneath it. Something they hadn't noticed in years. The faint pulse of being. No one is asking for anything. No one needs saving. And for the first time, they begin to wonder if they could exist, even without a reason. Healing from the need to be useful isn't about learning to stop giving. It's about learning to give without disappearing. It's the slow process of returning to one's own humanity, relearning how to inhabit a self that was long abandoned in the service of others. At first, it feels strange to rest without justification, to decline an invitation, to say, "I can't right now," without over-explaining. But slowly, the nervous system, once wired for constant service, begins to calm. The body starts to remember what safety feels like when it's not constantly earning it, and from that quiet safety, clarity begins to form. They start to recognize the difference between genuine care and obligation, between love that flows freely and love that must always prove itself. From a psychological view, this is integration, the merging of the self that gives and the self that simply is. Therapists describe it as reclaiming internal permission, the right to exist without performing. It's not a single moment of awakening, but a series of small choices that say, I am allowed to be. The transformation doesn't look dramatic. It's found in simple acts, sitting by the window with a cup of tea, not answering the phone, taking a breath before saying yes. It's the quiet courage of letting others hold their own discomfort instead of rushing to fix it. They begin to see that their worth was never meant to be measured by usefulness, efficiency, or sacrifice. Worth, in its truest form, is unearned. It's not a reward for effort, it's a birthright. When they begin to see themselves through that lens, love starts to feel different too. They discover that real love doesn't demand exhaustion. It doesn't keep score or disappear when they rest. It holds space, even for their stillness. And so, the person who once believed they had to be needed to belong begins to live in a gentler truth, that being is, in itself, enough. They still help, still give, but now, from a place of wholeness, not fear. Their kindness feels lighter, their presence quieter, their joy more sustainable. Because usefulness, when born from peace, is no longer a prison. It's a gift, one that includes the giver too, and as they walk through the world now, they no longer rush to fix what's broken. They listen. They rest. They allow. They understand that love does not grow in the soil of endless striving, but in the stillness of being seen, first by others, and finally by themselves.